So hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Salvador Munoz, and I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs and Outreach at Poster House, the first and only museum in the United States dedicated to the art and history of the poster. Tonight, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Queer Histories Poster History, where we are joined by Silas Munro and Brian Johnson of Polymode, a studio that leads the edge of contemporary graphic design for a deep dive into queer touchpoints across the poster medium. Whether advocating for queer rights or advertising the right to have a good time, posters and queer history go hand in hand. Silas Munro is a partner of Polymode and is particularly interested in the often unaddressed post-colonial relationship between design and marginalized communities. Brian Johnson is the other partner at Polymode. He is a member of the Monacan Nation and is deeply invested in the production of good design without the expense of sacrificing our humanity. So before we get started, I just want to share a few accessibility notes for this event. Automated closed captioning is available, and you can turn it on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. This program is being recorded and will be made available for all registered attendees at the conclusion of the event. And if you have any questions during the program, you can drop the questions in the chat or the Q&A box, and I'll go ahead and vocalize them for you. Just remember to set your chat to everyone so that everyone can see your questions and it doesn't look like I'm talking to myself. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Brian and Silas.
Thank you. I will get started by the usual dance of, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, it's looking good, Brian. So
Awesome.
we're here to talk about queer history is poster history.
So we'll just take a second to also introduce ourselves. A really quick introduction. I'm Brian Johnson. My pronouns are he, they, and this is my business partner and best friend.
I'm Silas Munro, other partner, Polymode, pronouns are he or they, and we're really looking forward to sharing this. But before we start, wanted to make a land acknowledgement that we'll be speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Ohlone tribe, which is in Saratoga, California.
And we also want to take a moment to remember those that have come before us, also those that have been taken from us during the struggle for queer liberation, and also those that have taken from us by acts of aggression or violence.
Yes, we also wanted to acknowledge the observation of Juneteenth. And as you'll see in our presentation, that queer people of color are a huge part of the history of queer design and queer liberation.
And then we also just want to take a moment to say, hey, y'all, let's celebrate. Like, we're here, we're queer. We're really thankful to actually be giving this talk today for Poster House. So thanks to Salvador and Maya and Zipong. And thanks to everyone who is here virtually. We appreciate you being here. And to all the people that will watch this in the future, we're also going to speak out to the future and say thanks for watching this again or for the first time. So with that, let's get to it. So we thought we'd just start with some of our work and talk about Polymode for a hot second. So Silas, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, so Polymode's a studio that engages with the edge of contemporary graphic design. We're really interested in not only practicing design, but also poetic research and like how and where ideas come from. Our work takes a range of different forms, from publications, identities, websites. I did want to call out that typeface that's animating, which is called Polymode Sans. That was a collaboration with XYZ Design and has a realness index. So it has a sort of queerness embedded into the typeface.
So we are also a bi-coastal LGBTQ+ minority-owned studio. So my studio is in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Silas's is in Inglewood, California. We also have other designers in Florida. We have collaborators all over the world, and we really like changing this new idea of what a studio means and how it can mean in different time spaces at the same time and place. And our list of clients is a lot of museums you might have been to. We love making books for them, but we also love doing things that also can help uplift marginalized voices. And we also love teaching. And we also have another class, and I'll do a shameless shout out to BIPOChistory.com if you want to check that out as well. And with that, let's hop into the posters.
Yeah, so as we go through this presentation, we're going to be referencing a poster that we designed that is a queer critique of this poster and book cover that Alfred H. Barr designed. He was the first director of the MoMA, and it was about this show called Cubism and Abstract Art, and is very problematic in terms of how it's referencing non-Western cultures. And so, Brian, if you want to go to the next slide.
Of course.
We were commissioned by Ellen Lupton and a bunch of other co-authors who wrote a book called Extra Bold, a feminist, inclusive, anti-racist, non-binary field guide for graphic designers, to make a queer critique. So, Brian, if you want to talk about the poster a little bit more.
Sure. So how we jumped into this was we thought about queerness in general over a span of, let's say, the past 200 years. And so we started from what we sort of knew. Stonewall, what was the Stonewall Inn and Bar? And we thought about what were the Stonewall riots and how the Stonewall riots were sort of started by queer and trans people of color that literally picked up that brick and smashed it through the window to sort of say, you know, we demand equal rights. And so we started to really deep dive into all the different things that we knew about queerness, what we knew, books, culture, people, influences, movements, and we started to document all these things.
Yeah, I think in addition to sort of queer people, you know, Stonewall is a good example of also a queer space. And so on the right, you see Bob Dumran's address book, which had a listing of queer bars, cruising spots. And so I think a lot of queer posters and queer design is like addressing how do you make a safer, more inclusive space.
We also started to look at codes, printing, color, objects, and also other pieces of history. And so when you look at sort of how pink is used or how we can talk about queerness, you know, the pink triangle and how the persecution by the Nazis, not only for homosexuals, but for any sort of minority, and how it was used to sort of like label us and document us, but then how that was also then queered and inverted for like Butt Magazine and some that you might know now, but also how it was used for Silence Equals Death during the AIDS crisis.
Yeah, I think part of the research and what we've already acknowledged is this like tension between activism and pleasure. On the left, you see a selection from the project called Gay Semiotics that Hal Fisher worked on, that was a kind of photographic and textual analysis of queer codes and community. And then in the middle, we have a Gay Liberation Front poster, as well as like photographs of the Gay Liberation Front that came out of this like revolutionary moment, became also this kind of form of a lot of collectives organizing together.
So then how do we take all these things and synthesize it? So we truly started by just saying, what are different modes that we could walk through all this information, and how could we share and show this information? So of course it was the original. Are there other ways? Should we use symbols? Should we use color? You know, should we think about the use of the rainbow? Is it accessible? And we just kept going through all these iterations.
Yeah, and I just wanted to shout out Ben Warner, who is a former student of mine, who really helped us work on this project and really think about like, how do you create visual signifiers for queerness? And we really like spread the gamut, like referencing rainbows, do we use images, and try to bring that in, as well as text and other pieces of design. But ultimately felt like, if you go to the next slide, Brian, that this idea of like having it reference bar, but using these sort of like queer and overlapping and intersecting relationships. And I think that's also one of the hallmarks of queer community, is that like it's messy, right? It's not like always a direct or straight line, but you know, queer overlaps and interconnections occur through time.
And you can also see that we have like nodes, we have like dotted lines, because things are also talking to each other through space and time. And so nor do we think this is the definitive way and sort of like the end all be all of what this poster should be. It was just like version 1.0. Like we know it's going to change. We know it's going to shift. You know, time is still going to march on and we're going to have to expand this and expand it and expand it. But you have to start somewhere. And so this is where we got started. And so for today, we figured we should probably get started around here. As we've already mentioned, liberation. I think that's a kind of a great part of like why Pride is here and why we should keep Pride a part of our continuity as queer people. So let's start there.
Yeah, and we mentioned queer folks of color, of course, Marsha P. Johnson. In this photograph, she's handing out flyers in support of gay students at New York University in 1970s. And so there's this like, already you can see in this like handmade sign. And it's interesting because we're showing some things that are not like technically posters in this, but I think in queer histories and queer design, there is like a myriad of media and forms that inform that. That idea of also like using posters or design in public, in protests, or also in queer spaces reoccurs.
And DIY is okay. And I think we need to, as a collective, get over this idea that you have to have a printing machine or a silk screen, and you can't make beautiful things out of paper and cut paper and pens and pencils. And there's some vitality in that when you really just have to get your thoughts or just get sort of the protest out.
Yeah, and so this first poster that we're going to talk about is a collaboration by Juan Carlos Vidal and Nestor Latoronco. It's called Gay is Angry. It's from 1971 and is this like amazing collage of a sense of collective agency that like followed the Stonewall uprisings. These two queer designers of color were connected to the Third World Gay Revolution, which was a group that came out of that New York gay liberation movement. And this idea of like a ticking time bomb on top of a heap of text fragments that include corporate logos and headlines, which is referencing like this procession of signs, probably clipped from newspapers or magazine, and this idea of like collage, but then this kind of like density and intensity of like the butterflies are coming out of this bomb. So there's like tension, challenge, but also liberation and like rainbows, right?
And the thing about this is that also it's a rainbow pole. So there's something like when you have a printing press, you can actually put all the colors on the top of your screen, and it's called a rainbow font. You can just pull all the colors. And so every single time you keep pulling through the silk screen or you run it through a press, it will always come out different, and it will like have a nice sort of glisten between all the colors that will then meld on the actual plate itself, and then we'll give each piece a little nuance or a little queerness, and so that they're all different. And so you can see how this pulls across it, and keep that in mind because we're going to have a lot of rainbow pulls in many different ways show up through these posters.
And Lincoln did mention in the chat that is it's actually a Rezo, I think, not a silk screen, to kind of get that Rezo or offset.
And so here you can see the use of this like Art Deco typeface. Again, another rainbow pull of just seeing how different colors can skew across the poster itself. We didn't have it paired with, we support Gente, so that it was hand-drawn and hand-lettered and probably hand-colored, which is also a support of a lesbian softball team.
Yeah, and I think part of when you start really looking at this range of queer posters, there's just such a wide representation of community that are presented. This is actually a piece that came out of the One Archives at USC, and it's this Midwest Lesbian Conference and Music Festival. And I think part of what we were also thinking about is when we hear the story of queerness, we tend to like focus on the coasts. And so we wanted to also include and represent like other voices of queerness across the country.
There's also this whole idea of it being utopian and imaginative. And so the axe was used as a symbol to sort of like, fight for our rights, but then you can see how the axe also then goes and becomes stars. And so it's this idea of that we can keep some of our imaginative, playful self alive, and we can sort of dream of what a utopia could be for queer people, especially like moving forward and like moving into something new. I love this one because it's like it has a lot of hand done and hand drawn type here. You can see there's a figure. They have a small little button that says gay on it. It's a fist to also say that there's some sort of like power to be taking back. The poster actually reads full rights for gays, end racism and sexism, disunity the problem, solidarity the answer. And we felt like this just really kind of started into that march of the 70s of like, we demand equal rights. We are not a mental disorder. We are, should be removed from the DSM sort of categorization. And so like, this is where we sort of came through in the 70s after the Stonewall moving forward. Not being fired from our jobs, equal rights of pay, all the things that we still maybe kind of forget about. And we should keep bringing it up when we talk about queer history.
Yeah, and this poster, one last comment too, also just like addresses those tensions of like unity and discordantness within queer communities, and just like how it kind of calls out the intersectional challenges that the queer community faces. I felt was like really powerful message.
So these posters were designed by Gilbert Baker, who also designed the pride flag. And so again, we have this, crazy rainbow pole. You can see how it's not easily done. You can see how it's not perfect. There are imperfections every time you actually pull through it. It's using copper black. There's a light version to it, and sort of just shows where everyone's meeting. This is the San Francisco City Hall, and it's a very sort of simplified poster. And here's a nice detail, so you can see how that pole actually works when it comes through.
And this was designed by Gilbert Baker, who is also the creator of the first iteration of the pride flag. So it's interesting to sort of see that like color as a representation for queerness, and also like hope and optimism and celebration that comes out of embracing our queerness in public spaces.
But then we wanted to get into more posters moving forward of, these are from the March on Washington on October the 14th, and also this whole idea of, coming out. And so we wanted to stop here and talk about coming out, because in some places it is really important, especially like at this time, in the late 70s, that to get rights, you must gain critical mass. You must be able to say, I'm here, I need to be counted, I deserve my rights. What I think we're also forgetting in this whole auspice and time from where we are now is that that's a very privileged North American concept of outness, and that some individuals from different countries, even if they are in a very liberal country like the United States, if they were to come out, those ripple effects could then also cost them their lives, their families, their lives, their jobs, and their livelihoods. And so just understand that it's great to come out, and I am an out homosexual male, and I'm very proud to be out, but some people can't be, and we just wanted to point that out as well.
Yeah, and I think some of that symbolism of critical mass that Brian, you were talking about, was like in the symbol of the March on Washington, which actually in '79, there were more than 100,000 people who attended the rally. And you have these kind of symbols of male and female symbols kind of overlapping to create this capital. And then I think that also ties to the figures on the right poster, which kind of have this androgynous, gender nonconforming representation. And I think that is true even as we have liberation, we're dealing with privilege, right, within our own communities. And I think what's interesting about the history of these posters is also we're facing and dealing with these issues again. Someone had mentioned the, Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, like we're still being challenged to be safe in our own country.
And I feel like in that moment, you can also see this figure in the come out posters dancing, that there is a true joy and lightness of being when you can be who you are and be your true and authentic self. And it actually is a moment of play and a moment of pleasure. And so again, going against these old Protestant affirmations of like, that is supposed to be locked away and denied us, that mode of freedom and to be different and to be queering and to, curve how everything kind of can and should be in this idea of a utopia. But that takes struggle. And we've gone through a lot of struggle as queer people in the United States, especially as we start to approach the 80s and the AIDS crisis. And so here, if you didn't know, is that in the United States, when AIDS was actually starting to really affect a lot of and kill a lot of people in the United States, our government did not act fast enough, and did not care. And so it took a grassroots organization called ACT UP to literally act up and cause a lot of gumption and a lot of issues for people in power to say we will be heard and we will be seen here. And so you can see in this poster that these activists are holding tombstones because so many people still die to this day and still are dying and still are suffering. And so ACT UP was there, and they had die-ins, and they complained, and they shut down streets, and they shut down avenues. And this is just a moment to say that there's a lot of protest. And so you have a lot of anger and you have a lot of aggression, but you also have a lot of grief. Do you want to talk about these?
Yeah, totally. And, I'm just like, I'm feeling that grief, that you're talking about. And, earlier in my career, I had the chance to work for Housing Works, which was an HIV/AIDS nonprofit that came out of the ACT UP movement. And just that, like, the power you're talking about, Brian, of like protests, but also like needing to create structures of community and create our own supportive services in moments when the government was not showing up. And, I hate to be a harp on this, but also part of the way HIV and AIDS also affected queer people of color first, and those who were like homeless or low income, like the most vulnerable folks in the community get affected first. And I think that transitioning between that last photograph of that activism event, we're also looking at this series of memorial protest posters that's designed by the LA chapter of ACT UP in 1991, and this idea of also queer icons. And like part of our research and part of the process has been about like trying to connect to these mentors that we lost. And these icons that from Sylvester, who was groundbreaking in music and performance, or Robert Mapplethorpe as an artist, and Robert Navarro, a video artist, political activist, writer, like these, the stories of people and the importance of specific people standing in for the larger queer community.
And you can also tell, again, this is a very DIY photocopier, got to get it out, got to get it done to make this thing, because something has to exist versus nothing. And one of the things I was telling Silas is when we were preparing this, I was like, it still looks like small little gravestones from either Arlington or other, veterans. And so it just keeps on coming. And so that was something that we just had a moment with today.
And the idea of also like using the means of what you have, right? The urgency and like getting things out there. And I think you can also see that in this A Day Without Art, Visual AIDS, which is an amazing organization that is all about archiving the histories of artists affected by HIV and AIDS. And they created this Day Without Art that is also connected to World AIDS Day. And just looking at the graphic nature of the poster. And I think not only do you have this like amazing sort of vibrant, like intense headline that is like breaking apart or, expressing a sense of loss, but you see there's also a lot of information on this poster. And I think normally think of a poster as having like a quick read, but some of the things that we were thinking about also is this idea of like posters as queer knowledge bases, where you can also have like a deeper connection, a deeper read over time.
There's also something to be said about how the amount of information is also thick columns. Remember that even though this was made in '89, the Vietnam War had just ended. You're going to have the Vietnam Memorial. You're going to have all these names, and you have this understanding of death that is pretty prevalent in the American consciousness. And so just to remember that these sort of understandings of mass death have been sort of prevalent at the time. And so you can also see call-in responses to other things that have been happening in history. And then we come to the Silence Equals Death poster. Avram Finkelstein and Brian Howard, Oliver Johnston, Charles Kurloff, Chris Leone, and Jorge Socaras did this for ACT UP. And it was if I'm remembering right, Silas, it was the Art Workers Coalition. Or no, it was inspired by them, is what it came by, like later on, correct?
Yeah, this Silence Equals Death project was something that was like connected to ACT UP, but I think what's interesting and also important to think about is like all the multiplicity, right, of like different things happening at the same time and influencing each other, and this like needing to organize in very like complex and unique ways, and this kind of like open source graphic language where like the folks around the silence equals death were like using the signifier and sharing it and allowing many other folks to circulate graphics, and how it has become this kind of iconic thing that we still are dealing with this global health issue where, you know, still have millions of people living with HIV.
So from that, we then want to shift into what other art was made in response to. So General Idea, which consisted of three amazing gentlemen, A. Bronson, Felix Pars, and Horizontal, and they were also using satire and humor to thumb their finger at pretty much everything within the world, within culture, and within the art establishment. And here's where they took a play on Robert Indiana's 1966 Love Sculpture, which has, you know, the slightly angled letter form, and you can see that they did it here with the D, and it is based on Clarendon Bold, if you didn't know. You can see how the O in love was slanted, and so they copied it and mimicked it, and this is another screen print. And the only one of the three that's still alive is A. Bronson. So now let's talk about safe sex. Let's talk about the fun stuff. Let's talk about the reason that we do like to have pleasure. But the thing is that we have to be careful now because AIDS is around, HIV is around. We do need to protect ourselves and our families and our friends. And one way to get through that part of the 90s, as I am a child that was raised in this time in the 90s, is that you have to really consider safe sex. And what does that mean? And so at the time, like, look at how AIDS activism and AIDS awareness is based on red. So the color red is here on both posters. You have one that's more like photo representative, and you have one that's Keith Haring that's pretty blunt with a very happy penis that's looking to possibly have a condom taken off or put on it.
Yeah, I think just highlighting on the left, this design is a series of posters and features the iconic photography of Stephen Meisel, who is a well-known fashion photographer. And so this idea of both like using desire and erotic and pleasurable images to normalize safe sex. And so to equate this idea of sexual liberation and safety together. And I think it's just really striking to see the comparing these two approaches as like really different visual languages, but looking and seeking the same kind of like impact. And I think also sort of seeing how the visual language of both of these are starting to like engage with like a level of like pop culture, right? And this idea of like speaking to mass audiences and also tapping into visual languages that are like broader than the queer community as a way to sort of like destigmatize safe sex.
But there's also a reverse to that too. And that could be said as like, it's not necessarily about the sex act or the pleasure or the imagery or the body. It's also, can we as a collective just talk about this? And so here it's just, you know, in terms of, you know, the AIDS Project of the East Bay came together and they're like, look, we need to make sure that these individuals, especially trans individuals, know if they have to be out there and having sex and they have to use sex as a way to make money, it's like, please take care of yourself. And this is how. And so a lot of it is just a simple conversation rather than it being a hypersexualized sort of way of just like, take a moment and just read this. And so in a way where it's just someone is looking at you and trying to say, do you see yourself here? Now, please take this information in and consider it. So sort of like a way of turning the volume down.
Yeah, and these posters were also a series too, and feature the work of Hopeton Stewart, who is a Pasadena-based Black photographer. And this idea of like speaking and seeing ourselves represented in the design of queer campaigns, I think is really important and notable. And also the idea of kind of multiplicity and, you know, communicating the same message, but with different images and text. And also even just the like plain spoken like headline, right? Like it's, you feel like someone in your community is speaking to you and with you rather than like feeling like there's this kind of like officiality to it. But then it's interesting because that's also paired with this kind of visual language that feels, like official at the same time. So there's this like code switching between like the casual and the formal.
I mean, because even right now, like, look at how, Silas, you and I are sitting here chatting. It's like, girl, can we talk? And what are you going to do? Like, you're going to put your hand up on your face and you're going to lean in. And so you have this moment of like, this is reality, right? There's one way of saying this is a hot sex act that's been photographed, but this is sort of a, let's get real. Let's have it like an up close sort of moment. And I know you want to talk about these.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, these are, it's one poster front and back. This is for GMHC, Gay Men's Health Crisis, which was like another collective that came out of the AIDS crisis in New York City, connected to Larry Kramer's activism. This is printed in 1990. And I just was struck by this poster having both bilingual, both English and Spanish, and two-sided. And so the poster also is fold out. So it kind of works at the scale of like posting up and like having this impact of this headline that says, just do it safer, and like enjoying sex that's safe. You can do it all. Tú puedes hacer de todo. Like being able to also have this like bright color palette and dynamic information. And this also connects to that sort of term that I was using earlier, but this idea of like queer knowledge bases. So there's a lot of information. So this is pre-internet, but almost feels like a web page, right? Where you can kind of zoom in and get more information as you go closer. And then also has these like drawings in visual language that like both kind of look like ancient cave drawings depicting groups of people, but also this like phallic form that's like in the background. There's just a lot of like multiplicity of form happening at the same time.
And it's also fun. I mean, take a step back. I mean, I'm dating myself, but like, welcome to Saved by the Bell. Like, welcome to like the Valley in the 90s and like the use of bright neon colors, and it's playful and it's hand done. So we're going to bring that back up too, is that there's a level of queerness where a sense of play comes back into these. It's not just sort of like must be done on computer, must print out. I mean, sometimes you have to just do that, but there was time and effort put into this to also make it a pleasure to sort of be up on the wall or to come back to it and read it again and again. But I want to get into one of my favorite things, which is talking about spirituality in a very tongue-in-cheek and sarcastic kind of way. And this is like, hey, every 10th Jesus is a queer. And so this is also a reference to one in every 10 people is someone who is bisexual, homosexual. And that comes from Kinsey's research from the 50s. And so I love this because you have this classic image of Mary and John the Baptist and Jesus together. It's also on a pink paper, so back to pink coloring, with purple as the main ink. So this whole idea of like regal queerness. And you have John the Baptist kissing and or about to kiss Christ. So first and foremost, there's an age difference between the two of them. They're only 6 months apart. So I just have an issue about the painting itself. But you have Mary who is there watching. So there's this idea of voyeurism and acknowledgement and understanding. And I just love that this is where it's also sort of thumbing our noses at the establishment of art, but also just taking a 1 in 10 and letting it be something else. And really, I mean, because we know people that would get pissed off at this, but I think it's pretty rad. And I love the sort of play on art and culture and spirituality and the art establishment too.
I love that analysis. I think one thing also to call out is this critique of religious stigma and judgment, in this case, Christianity, but many, global religions have this history of like oppressing queer folks. And so there's this kind of that irreverence, right, that you're talking about as a way to like push back against that sense of judgment.
And that judgment also came with power, because we know what, religious groups did. Religious groups had power. But speaking of power, don't just question authority, fuck it.
Yeah, this is designed by AgFe, which is a Los Angeles collective, designed in 1990 to 93. There's a bluntness to it. There's a directness to it. There's sort of playing with links back to the gay semiotics, this idea of code, S&M, the sort of macho or clone look. but then also a critique of a homophobic state senator whose name was John Briggs, who at the time was pushing for legislation was called Proposition 6, which was about banning LGBTQIA plus 2S educators in the classroom, which feels very resonant and relevant to now. And it's both, I think in some ways consoling to see that other queer ancestors have dealt with this, but also highly frustrating that we continue to have to battle and advocate for our equality. And so part of that history of queer design is these cycles of call and response that we're constantly trying to create escape velocity to create utopia. And sometimes we need to just say, fuck it.
And just enjoy the fact that most people don't want to see an ass like this. Cool, we're just going to leave it here for another hot second because, you know, take note, he's also a cop, or the idea of role play, the helmet, the glasses, the baton. So everything that comes with that as well. We also wanted to point out the question marks and the exclamations that are also being used in the background. But it's also about the different things of the 90s, talking about advertising, stereotypes, this whole movement to have people stand up like a Calvin Klein advertisement, where it's a black and white photograph. It's very Herb Ritts and Bruce Weber. Notice the use of Helvetica. You know, do you love the dyke in your life? How they're sort of just like, they're standing there, they're empowered, they are themselves, but also that there is a racial inclusion here, that we have, you know, women of color that do contribute to these movements and the aesthetics, and they are present. And especially at the time in the 90s, they are still taking care of all the gay men who are dying. And like, we tend to forget that as well, because they were a very strong supporter and still are of queer communities. And we don't want to forget that.
Yeah, and I think that kind of the parody of the language of advertisement too, and being tongue in cheek, and yeah, as Brian Perry mentioned, you know, Futura, which, you know, connected these Calvin Klein advertisements, but, you know, queering them and also centering women's and women of color's voices and presence and image.
So then from there we hop into, what do you do in the late 80s and in the late 90s when you, and the aughts, when you now have to start raising money for AIDS? Because now that you have better drugs, better access to drugs, for some people, you also still need to raise a lot of money. Healthcare is expensive. And so Martin Vanesky just happened to be a teacher of Silas and ours, and we were really inspired by him. And so Martin runs a company called Appetite Engineers, or a studio. And so this is his artwork for Art for AIDS to raise money. And so you can see how Martin is using other forms of play again. Little icons here, we'll zoom in and let you see, using different forms of letters, spaces, glyphs, iconography, and then building these by hand, and then photocopying them and looking at them. And then after he sort of figured out what he wants to do, he then puts it back together. You can see the use of color, silk screening again. And it's a beautiful way of play, but also yet again, still dealing with something that the whole community is still reeling in the 2000s of, our friends are dead, our teachers are dead, our leaders are wounded, right? Like, how can we sort of get over this? And so it's adding another symbol of, or another understanding of lightness to it that I think is just really beautiful.
Yeah, and Brian, can you go back to the full poster? There's just something I want to point out. Notice that there's sponsorship logos at the bottom, so you can see United Airlines. And so there's this like cultural shift where the public's attitude towards AIDS is shifting and creating more support for research and prevention, you know, which took many, you know, decades of advocacy to really get to start to have that kind of conversation. But yeah, just like Martin's work is just so innovative and kind of calling back to those DIY works that we saw, but then also using, you know, offset, you know, production and like formal design languages to kind of like blend those two levels of visual form. We also, yeah, so This is a quote from Fierce Pussy. I'm a stone butch, androgyne, femme, tomboy, girlfriend, sapphic, deviant, and proud. They're a collective of queer women that met as part of a splinter off of the ACT UP group. They met in 1991, and they wanted to give voice to the lesbian feminist perspective. So the founding members, Joy Episala, Carrie Yamako, Nancy Brooks Brody, and Zoe Leonard, who wrote that famous poem that went around, I Want a Dyke for a President. They sort of like embrace these derogatory terms, lesy, dyke, bulldogger, and like added these ideas of like pride. And it's another example of queer repurposing of language, right? Like we take the barbs that hit us and hurt us, and we turn them into words of empowerment and sort of a clear stance of who we are.
But they also made this great where it's like if this person were still alive today, he'd still be living with AIDS. It's also this understanding that like it just didn't go away, even though it's, you know, it's been 20, it's been 30 years. And so it's like really leaning into, you know, take and understand, like if you take a moment to read this, it will sink in, and it's still really heavy.
Yeah, and this is a broadsheet, so there also like is another side, and the pronouns shift too. So this is sort of like a second wave of Fierce Pussy's work happening in 2013, and sort of this like call to keep remembering and keep bringing sort of the personal into also that like public. And you see those sort of nods back to that red color, right? That Brian, you were calling out about like AIDS awareness and the AIDS ribbon, but in a very like, you know, 21st century typographic aesthetic that has a kind of boldness and a wall of language that urges you to pay attention and remember.
So take a breath for a second now. We've taken you through a lot of time and space. And so you can kind of see that we're moving from sexual liberation, and we're also sort of heading towards the sort of the middle lower right-hand section, getting into the human rights campaign, rights, rainbow capitalism, and PrEP. And so this is where we're going to kind of head towards as we finish off our chat. So again, now we're sort of like, we're kind of in the contemporary of where we are now. And so you can see the use of a rainbow color, of a full rainbow pull. So like, look at where now everything is the full rainbow. It's not just 3 or 4 colors or what is actually at the print shop. Now it's this whole idea of like a mainstream, right? So like Pride has to be a full rainbow. It's sort of like, it cannot be segmented anymore here. And so what does this also mean in terms of rainbow capitalism and marketing at a very specific time directed toward them gay dollars? And it's time to buy that, you know, that gay pride t-shirt, and it's time to buy these different things. And so what does it actually mean? But then we also wanted to talk about like, what is the poster actually talking about here? So like, yeah, they're proud to be gay, but they're not as proud of what some of their last nice choices would have been. Yeah, I probably drank too much. No, I shouldn't have gone home with him. But also like, oh, we didn't have a condom. Or like, I did make a bad choice, or I kind of forgot what happened and I don't really know. And so it's having these other sort of moments of conversation within queerness that we still need to be having. And this is a way of also bringing something back up, a little bit maybe too tongue in cheek, but it is possible to still guess that, you know, yeah, maybe I did make some bad decisions last night. But also the use of this idea of glitter. It's not only, you know, magical, but this whole idea of, you know, exfoliating your body.
Yeah.
Take it or leave.
And like, I think this just building on what you were saying, Brian, this idea of like marketing to a gay audience and like how that connects to rainbow capitalism and like using, you have sort of corporate voices, like even Boston Pride is branded, you know, has an icon and logo and visual language.
But there are also good things to be learned about not making good choices, is that now we can also have, you know, talking about the use of PrEP and like removing stigma and HIV prevention and treatment out of sort of like the larger conversation.
Yeah, this is a campaign designed by Canadian artist Sabdid Ali, who created these illustrations both in English and French. And there's this kind of like softening in the illustration style that merges like human folks and also lettering at the same time as a way to normalize prep use and also just like kind of make it more accessible and continued accessibility in terms of different language speaking audiences.
I would also say age as well, because there's also a point where, you know, as an individual, you're finishing high school, you're moving into sort of like post-high school, possibly college, university. And there is a time where as an 18 or 19-year-old, you should consider this. And so it's something that is also accessible to that age demographic, but it could be for anybody. But I think that is something to, you know, be thought about here. So Stonewall is now a name that's been sort of like reverberating around the world in terms of rights, especially gay rights. And so this use of Stonewall is Stonewall in the United Kingdom. They're a nonprofit that's been around for about 25 years, and they were acting out against Section 28, which was a piece of legislation that banned the so-called promotion of homosexuality. So again, please remember, this stuff is still around. It hasn't left. It's still on the law books. Like, we're not as protected as you think. And so you do have to show up, and we do have to say with critical mass, we are here, and come out for them. But it doesn't necessarily mean just come out as queers. We also have to have our allies join us as well. And so here you can see that they're trying to also point out that, you know, you have queer people within sports industry, but also within sort of music. And then what does it mean to also still have these posters and these signs when they're out for pride parades to say that, you know, some people are trans, get over it. Some people are gay, get over it. There's a beautiful directness and bluntness to it that I think kind of sticks through, as you've seen through this through line of what we've shown you. It's pretty evident, like bluntness can actually have a good effect. And then there are also some hard ones to take. So these are posters that we're going to show you from Amnesty International, and this is very much from the Czech Republic. And the transcription reads, you know, they can get deported for this, ridiculously celebrating goals during football. And so they're just trying to point out that in Russia, this is considered an illegal act.
Yeah, and this really resonated with me too, as someone who's half Ugandan, where Uganda also has had homosexuality be punishable by death and now like imprisonment. And so this idea of like a reminder that there is a global challenge for queerness and a global challenge for this idea of pride, and finding ways like these Amnesty International posters to like really sort of think about the scale of the message too, and like having a broader impact as a way to try to support activism and shifting of culture.
I also love these because consensual touch, I feel like within both heteronormative and like homosexual like groupings with your friends, we don't actually do it and show it enough. We should be holding each other's hands and giving each other's hugs and like touching each other like with that consent. And here, like just seeing two men on a football team touching each other's asses, like that's a great thing to see. And to think about how this could be on a bus or on a billboard, like, don't you want to be able to see that and go, not only is that hot, it makes me feel seen. And I like that sort of like consent and that sort of touches humanity hasn't been sort of like stripped away from visuality and from culture itself.
And then our second to last poster that we want to show is the work by Amos Kennedy, who made this really powerful letterpress poster. He works in letterpress and kind of upturns racial stereotypes, where he calls himself just a humble Negro printer, and he's like part of this sort of legacy of Black printing. And it's just really cool to see, you know, allyship in the form of this poster where it says, "I knew God was Black, but I didn't know they were trans." And I think that is also like part of kind of a future and ongoing like works towards progress, is non-queer folks advocating and supporting and showing solidarity with our movements. And lastly, we just want to highlight the work of Nat Piper, who is a non-binary alphabet artist, graphic designer, and has created this amazing body of work called A Queer Year of Love Letters. These are posters that are based on original typefaces that Nat has created connected to history of queer activists, including Ernestine Ecclestone, who was a Black lesbian organizer, who's one of the only people of color to picket the White House at a 1965 gay rights demonstration. But there's also like just a broad range of so many different other activists, including Martin Wong, who is a gay Chinese American painter who died of AIDS, and was, references his use of hands gesturing in American Sign Language.
I was about to say, that's the one thing that I really like, is that you're pulling in sign language, though it's not raised. You could say like Braille, and the use of, it's not the actual letter forms, but different modes of accessibility is really strong here for me. And again, getting back into the use of purple. Like, I love how you can see these thematics of certain colors sort of like ring through, especially coming out of the AIDS crisis, pulling back other colors that are kind of showing up. I love that. And then we also just wanted to show this fantastical detail that also consists of the underline and people still protesting.
We also just wanted to leave with some resources. There's a video playing right now from a website called Days of Rage that was organized by Andy Campbell, which features a number of the posters that we talked about and the research of other queer activists and designers. And, we share this not alone, right? We have so many folks who have informed us, who have supported us, who we learn from and learn from each other. We also had mentioned Extra Bold earlier in the talk. And then Brian, if you want to talk about some of the other, just some of the other.
Yeah, I'm just gonna zip through it. But yeah, it's like we really appreciate like the Letter Film Archive, public libraries, Poster House, of course, and visual aids. Like, it does take a village, and so we just want to just point back to always cite your sources, talk about them, collaborate. When you have tables like this of unearthing these vestiges of history that have been dyed or that have gone into sort of archival awareness, it's like it's time to pull these back up, and it's great to remember and to honor, and there's a space for everyone, and we can make room. And so we just wanted to say thank you. And then just also want to point out that if you do want to see our poster, it is on our Polymode Studio website, and you also can buy it as well. Give me that rainbow capitalism. And so thanks, everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. That was a fantastic presentation. It was so informative and energizing. And we're getting a lot of compliments in the chat right now, as I'm sure you all can see. If anybody has any questions, now's the time to get them in. We may be going a little over, but I think that's okay if no one minds. Yeah, Lincoln did ask a very interesting question to me about the intersection of queer poster art and other issues such as anti-war, or can you all speak to that a little? I know Silas, you responded a little bit on in the chat, but if you want to
no, that's really a really good point. One thing that I do just kind of want to mention, and Lincoln, just thank you for all your comments and feedback. I just really respect you as a scholar and fellow activist, and I'm always learning more things. There is a show that is about to open at the Letterform Archive called Strike Through, which is a history of typographic messages of protest. And in that show, myself, Stephen Coles, co-curator, Polymode, many folks at Letterform Archives talk about that idea of solidarity and call and response through multiple movements. So I hadn't seen that poster that you showed, Lincoln. That's really amazing. And I think an important we sort of look at this thing of queer history, right? But it's all these overlapping issues, and this idea of protest and social equity is so interconnected and so overlapping.
Yeah, I would also say that queerness exists at the axis of so many forms, global forms of oppression, that it's sort of impossible to advocate for queer issues in a silo. Yeah, so they're all interconnected. Do you know of any artists who are making queer posters that are addressing the LGBTQI phobia happening now? It's a great question from Kelly in San Francisco.
Ooh. I don't. I mean, now I'm going to have to dig it up because you've pointed out a good question. But there's also this quandary of like, who are the people on the ground that are looking and dealing with that, and like what is around them, right? So like there's also this idea that though we're very hyper connected, let's just say across the United States, and I'll just use the United States just as a quick reference, not to diminish or anything like that, but it's like who in the neighborhood, in where you live, in the community, in that queer community, it's sort of turning back to the smaller community to then go from there and then just see what's around you. I honestly don't know. We didn't find that many posters about queerness that we were using too. We kind of were just, using the bar sort of poster as a starting point, but we just kind of went from that and just made it ourselves. And there's also this idea of queerness of just like, cool, we'll just make it and we'll make it up, or we'll make it satirical, or, you'll just try to push it in that direction. I would love to see someone else do this in a different way using the same information. I mean, why not?
Yeah, I think there's so much vibrancy right now around like the activism of these like more current issues. I think we were kind of focusing more on the arc of history and like trying to bring it up to today, but I think that is like an area we could explore more for sure. And I think that's like, we're always feeling like this is like a work in progress, and like how do we keep like expanding and including and like being present. And I feel like one of the things we didn't really talk about was also the power of social media and digital technology as a way to like organize, and how like there's almost like an abundance, right, of folks who are using those platforms to create urgent messages of things we need to address. And I'm like, I can actually think of like just forgetting names, but like my social media feed, there's like so much information and so much folks posting and using graphics to like talk about these issues that that could be its own talk too, right? To talk about the right now.
Absolutely. And of course, like Brian and Silas were given like the impossible task of summing up 50 plus years of queer poster history in less than an hour. So I commend you on like the amazing job that you've been able to show so far. I do just want to highlight, because two brilliant queer poster makers who are actively addressing these issues today that I know of because we just did programs with them. The first being MICA, located in the Bay Area, and the second being Joanna Torino of the Unapologetic Street series, currently located in LA. And I'll add links to their programs with us to the follow-up email that we'll be sending. Let's see. Can you tell us a little bit about, so there was an interesting use in sort of the early posters that we showed that were very sort of like text heavy. Can you speak a little bit about that? Maybe.
Why? I mean, sure. I think attention spans shift. How we think about things shift. I would say marketing and like mass consumption, right? You have posters, you have television, you have radio, you have the airways, right? At the time, depending on how much money you have, how big your printing press is, how much type and how much physical space you can fill it on, sometimes those posters would stay up for a while, right? You had to get when you actually do an entire wall of posters and you just, mass bill something and then something else goes up around it, you might have to look at different ones to get the whole thing. But some of it is that might be the only time you get to see it. And so it's like you have to get in as much information as possible, I would think, at that time. And then later on, we know we can look it up on the internet, right? Before the advent of the internet, you had to go to the library and you had to find that book, or you had to find that zine, or you had to find that pamphlet. So sometimes it's just, this is all you have. And if you have my attention at least for 2 minutes, if I'm standing there, I can read more information. Kind of like Silas, the poster that you were talking about that had just all that information that you could read, but also enjoy it, where if someone did hang it up on a wall or in a guidance counselor's office or in a clinic or just somewhere where you could put it up where someone could read it, I would wonder if that's why there is more information, because you can't just open your phone now. I think it really is it's a time shift in how information is shared.
Yeah, I feel like my theory is like about the urgency, like being able to use typography like is a more immediate act, I think, in a certain way, especially if you're not a skilled illustrator or designer, like that you can kind of reach for lettering and text as a way to like make your mark and make a point. And then I think that kind of like more rich graphic language has evolved over time, right? As we also are like being referenced and influenced by other activists and other queer design.
Absolutely. And I think we can sort of see that sort of like arc like throughout your presentation, right? Like as it becomes more commodified, more like glossy, you know, a lot of that like text-based like DIY starts to like fade into the background. Great questions, y'all. Hi, I'm a queer Christian and I love the idea of using faith images as activism for the community. I was curious, has there ever been a poster using faith figures or ideology as activism or protest in support of the LGBT community that caused uproar that maybe didn't make it into the presentation tonight?
Off the top of my head, I only think of the ones that are more protesty and that aren't actually positive affirmations. But then I have to like really take a step back and start thinking, because like, yeah, the Rolodex of posters in history is kind of crazy.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, the rise of also like queer churches, you know, and like queer inclusive churches, I think is a really major factor. And like, I think if I would love to do more research about that too, like as someone who like was raised in a Christian household and is like trying to like reconcile, I think still like sort of spirituality and faith and like how that relates to my queerness, that like, I think are so many positive messages of like inclusive religious spaces, but that may be the place to start to sort of see like what posters and what visual language are those institutions and organizations using.
Or two things from me. One, make some.
Right. Because,
like there is this whole idea, like though, you know, like 1 in 10 Jesus is queer, like we don't talk about that. Like if you're going to say that, you know, Christianity is like if Christ is always coming back, because you always have to have this idea of love regenerating itself and also spreading the message of love, which is really hard, by the way, that if you think about that poster itself, is that eventually you're going to have a beautifully queer Jesus. And like think about that. I mean, that in and of itself is something to literally redo and put back up and say, hi, do you see this? That's a queer Jesus and like exists and is there, you know? So like, I would just love to support that. Like if you don't see them, make them. It's not hard to make things like that these days. So like for someone that does understand that some of the messages in Christianity are fantastic, some of them are not, especially the letters, but you know, like that's where it's like, make those please and help us make those and then put them out there and just make it more. And I also mean this with every faith too. It's like, just start making them to say that we accept all these different forms. I think it's great.
Yeah, it could be a whole nother presentation. So what do you think about the potential roles of queer postering today, especially since the public seems to be increasingly surveilled and otherwise limited?
Yeah, there's this text called Black Data that Shaka Magaram put out, who's like a writer and performance artist, where they were talking about like surveillance in relationship to like queerness and like some of the examples. And it was a South by Southwest talk as well, so you can like find the video online. I'll put a link to it and do like a quick search. But one of the examples in that was like this idea of an artist who had been using like masks to like while protesting or being in public that would prevent facial recognition. So I think that there are some really interesting like queer folks who are like kind of questioning that. And I feel like also after the murder of George Floyd, there were like all these really like thoughtful like activist packets that were dealing with these very things of sort of like how to protect yourself, both like physically in these protest spaces, but also like in terms of like being identified by like photography. So I think those are definitely things that are like in the zeitgeist and folks are addressing that right now, especially because we do feel like we're really in this like totalitarian like surveillance you know, state moment that's emerging.
And at the same time, like that's why we need maybe more things printed, more things handed out, distributed, because you never really know when other modes of communication could be cut out, blocked, banned, section from you, removed, taken out of a library. Like sometimes you might just need to get out that photocopier and mass blanket your neighborhood's mailboxes, right? Like these are like old school ways of revolt might have to come back into vogue. Like we need to consider that too as a collective.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as Lincoln points out, print is ephemeral, but it's much less ephemeral than the web. So I think that's a great point. We are a little over on time. I want to thank you, everyone who has stayed for us. And I'm wondering, just like as a closing, like sort of offering to the attendees, we talked a lot about like amazing organizations that have sort of like bloomed out of like the AIDS epidemic and have continued. I'm wondering if we could just give like one organization that we'd recommend people to support as like a closeout.
So many.
I know, there are so many.
I'm always a fan of the Trevor Project. Like people need places to go. They need to be safe. They need food. I would just say that.
Yeah, I mean, like there's so many queer organizations that like need our support, and I'm just like trying to think of like I mean, Trevor Project is a good one. I don't know, I'm blanking, sorry, I'm like
Housing Works.
Oh yeah, Housing Works. I did mention Housing Works in New York is really amazing, does amazing work. That's true. Thank you for that reminder.
Yeah.
But then again, also I would just push to say find local places in your community that need it, because I love big overarching sort of groups, but in all honesty, local is maybe I guess I'm just kind of like big on the local band right now, but it's like if it's nearby, someone needs your help literally within 5 miles. So like maybe consider that for anyone anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so keep that in mind as we close out Pride Month. Open up those wallets for more than just rainbow capitalism. Brian, Silas, thank you so much. This was fantastic. And thank you all for attending. I think that's all I have. Thank you again so much.
Thank you.
It was our pleasure.
Appreciate it being here.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. All right. Bye, everyone.